The US legal code is a gold mine of bureaucratic insanity, especially for hunting and fishing. We dug through the archives and pulled 100 regulations so absurd they read like a dare. From tactical ferrets to pajama-clad anglers, you're about to question everything you thought you knew about the great outdoors. Welcome to a legal safari into the absurd. 1. Alaska. You flew today, so you don't get to hunt today. In Alaska, there's a rule called same-day airborne that basically says, if you've been flying, you don't get to immediately go hunt big game like you're ordering a moose off DoorDash. Picture a guy named Kyle in a small bush plane, circling a valley like it's Google Earth with a propeller. He spots a trophy animal, lands, jumps out, and starts walking with the confidence of a man who thinks aviation is a hunting license upgrade. Then a game warden shows up with the emotional energy of a tax auditor. Sir, you were airborne. And suddenly, Kyle learns Alaska doesn't reward strategy. It rewards patience. The consequence isn't just a slap on the wrist. It's citations, seized gear, and a season ruined because he tried to turn wildlife into a drive-through. 2. Idaho. Fishing with explosives, the fastest way to become a criminal. In Idaho, using explosives, poison, or electricity to take fish is illegal, which sounds obvious until you remember laws exist because someone tried it. Imagine two buddies on the Snake River who spent all day getting skunked. One of them, drunk on ego and bad ideas, says the sacred words, "Watch this." He starts treating the river like a science experiment he failed in middle school. The law doesn't just say don't, it says we're not negotiating. Because this isn't fishing, this is environmental vandalism with bonus shrapnel. The aftermath isn't just dead fish. It's destroyed habitat, injured bystanders, and officers arriving like the final boss of consequences. If you wanted a quick catch, congratulations, you caught charges. Idaho doesn't hand out trophies for creativity. It hands out court dates. 3. Oregon. The 5-second rule doesn't apply to wildlife, so stop trying. Oregon bans taking fish with explosives or destructive substances, and the funniest part is how specific it has to be. Like the state already watched someone attempt DIY lake harvesting. Picture a guy in rural Oregon who thinks he's an innovator because he hates waiting for a bite. He stands on a riverbank with the confidence of a man who's never had a good idea, only loud ones. He throws something into the water, expecting a miracle. Instead, he creates a floating crime scene that can be seen from space. Fish die, birds scatter, the river turns into chaos. Then reality arrives in uniform and asks why he thought a public ecosystem was his personal buffet. The consequence isn't just a fine, it's gear confiscation, criminal charges, and becoming a local legend for all the wrong reasons. The man who tried to speed-run nature. 4. California. Tactical ferrets is not a plan, it's a cry for help. California is famously strict about wildlife protections, and the idea of using tactical ferrets for hunting sounds hilarious until you remember. California doesn't even want you casually owning certain animals, let alone deploying them like furry commandos. Picture an influencer named Brandon, who shows up to a rural property bragging about his outdoor setup. He's got a vest, a GoPro, and, because the universe loves comedy, he's brought a ferret like it's a certified tool. He's imagining a cinematic hunt. The state is imagining invasive species, disease risk, and people turning nature into a circus. The punchline is simple. Before Brandon can even pretend to be Bear Grylls, he gets introduced to paperwork, enforcement, and a world where, but it's cute, isn't a legal defense. He came for content. He left with a citation and public embarrassment. 5. Texas. Bow fishing is legal, until you hit the wrong fish and become the villain. Texas allows bow fishing, which means, yes, you can stand in shallow water pretending you're a medieval archer hunting dinner. But here's the catch. You can't just shoot anything that swims. The rules differentiate legal targets from protected game fish, and the difference matters the moment a warden sees your cooler. Picture a guy named Chad on a hot night, chest out, bow drawn, convinced every fish is just a moving bullseye. He takes the shot, celebrates, posts the photo, and then gets the worst comment of his life in real time. That's not a legal species. Suddenly, it's not a sport, it's evidence. The consequence isn't just losing the fish, it's fines, seized equipment, and a permanent lesson that Texas doesn't care how confident you felt. Nature is free. Regulations are not. 6. Kansas. Hunting from a car is not efficient. It's just illegal. In Kansas, hunting from a motor vehicle is illegal, which feels obvious until you remember human creativity peaks when laziness meets a rifle. Picture a guy named Randy cruising slowly down a dirt road like he's in a safari documentary he absolutely does not qualify to host. He spots a deer, rolls the window down, and decides nature has provided him with a drive-through hunting experience. Unfortunately for Randy, Kansas wildlife officers have seen this exact movie before, and they always play the same role: the ending. Because when someone turns a truck into a mobile sniper platform, it stops being hunting and starts being reckless stupidity with horsepower. The consequences hit fast: fines, confiscated weapons, possible license suspension, and the crushing realization that the deer got away while the law did not. 7. Minnesota. You can't chase deer with a boat like it's a water sport. Minnesota has regulations against pursuing wildlife from motorboats in ways that harass or endanger animals, which sounds oddly specific until you imagine the scenario that forced someone to write it down. Picture two guys in a fishing boat who see a deer swimming across a lake during migration. Instead of respecting nature, they see an opportunity to turn the entire ecosystem into a bizarre episode of extreme outdoor Olympics. The boat engine roars, the deer panics, and suddenly the situation escalates from stupid to dangerous in seconds. Wildlife officers don't view this as hunting. They view it as harassment, cruelty, and reckless behavior on public water. The consequences aren't funny: citations, license suspension, and a permanent reputation as the people who tried to turn a peaceful lake into a wildlife chase scene. 8. Wyoming. Spotlight hunting turns you into the villain of the forest. In Wyoming, using artificial light to spot animals at night for hunting, commonly called spotlighting, is illegal. The reason becomes painfully clear the moment someone tries it. Imagine a pickup truck rolling slowly across open land at midnight, headlights sweeping across fields like a low-budget alien invasion. The beam catches a deer, freezing it in place, blinded and confused. To the hunter inside the truck, it feels like an easy win. To the law, it's cheating on a level so obvious it might as well come with a confession form. Wildlife officers treat spotlighting seriously because it removes any concept of fair chase and turns animals into helpless targets. The consequences aren't subtle: fines, weapon confiscation, possible vehicle seizure, and the deeply embarrassing knowledge that your master hunting strategy was literally shine a flashlight and hope. 9. Florida. Feeding alligators is how you create a problem with teeth. In Florida, feeding wild alligators is illegal, and the reason is simple. Once an alligator associates humans with food, things escalate fast. Picture a tourist at a lakeside dock who decides tossing chicken scraps to a 10-foot prehistoric predator would make a great vacation story. At first, it works. The alligator appears, people laugh, phones come out. The problem is that now the animal has learned humans equal snacks. Wildlife officers know exactly what happens next. The gator loses fear, approaches people, and eventually someone gets hurt. When that point arrives, the animal usually gets euthanized. The human who started the mess? They get fines, charges, and the unforgettable realization that their quest for a cool Instagram video ended with a dead alligator and a legal nightmare. 10. New York. You can't shoot wildlife across a road like it's a shooting range. New York law prohibits discharging a firearm across public roads while hunting, and the logic becomes obvious the moment someone ignores it. Imagine a hunter spotting a deer across a rural highway and deciding the asphalt in the middle is just a minor detail. He lines up the shot like he's at a shooting range, forgetting that roads are where cars, people, and the occasional very confused dog exist. Wildlife officers treat this kind of behavior as dangerously reckless because a bullet doesn't care about traffic patterns. The consequences escalate quickly: serious fines, weapon confiscation, and potentially criminal charges, depending on how close that bullet came to turning someone's commute into a disaster. In New York, the rule is simple. If the shot crosses a road, you're not hunting anymore. You're creating a crime scene. 11. Arizona. Hunting camels is illegal, which raises an even stranger question. In Arizona, hunting camels is illegal, which sounds ridiculous until you learn there were once actual camels roaming parts of the American Southwest. In the mid-1800s, the U.S. Army experimented with camels as desert transport animals because apparently someone thought turning Arizona into a low-budget version of the Silk Road was a great idea. Most of those camels were eventually released or escaped, wandering the desert like confused tourists with humps. Fast forward to modern times, and the law still says you can't hunt them. Picture a hunter reading the regulation and wondering who exactly tried to start a camel safari in the Sonoran Desert. The law remains because wildlife officials prefer clarity over chaos. The consequence today isn't a camel stampede. It's the reminder that American laws often outlive the very weird history that created them. 12. Tennessee. Fishing with dynamite is not creative, it's just a crime. Tennessee law bans using explosives or toxic substances to catch fish, which again feels obvious until you imagine the exact kind of genius who made the rule necessary. Picture a group of friends on a quiet riverbank who spent all afternoon catching nothing but sunburn and disappointment. One of them suggests a faster method, which in this context means turning the river into an unplanned demolition test. The idea is simple: boom equals fish. The reality is catastrophic. Explosions don't just kill the fish you want, they kill everything else, damage habitat, and terrify anyone within hearing distance. Wildlife officers treat this like environmental vandalism with extra stupidity attached. The consequences aren't funny. Steep fines, criminal charges, confiscated equipment, and the permanent title of the guy who tried to turn fishing into a Michael Bay movie. 13. Wisconsin. Hunting while intoxicated turns the forest into a liability. In Wisconsin, hunting while intoxicated is illegal, which sounds like a rule that should never need explanation. Yet it exists because at some point, someone combined alcohol, firearms, and poor judgment in the middle of a forest. Imagine a hunter who treats opening day like a tailgate party, celebrating every missed shot with another drink. Confidence rises. Accuracy does not. Suddenly, the quiet woods are filled with unpredictable gunfire from someone whose balance and decision-making are both on vacation. Wildlife officers treat this rule seriously because the woods aren't a bar and rifles aren't party props. The consequences escalate fast. Fines, revoked hunting licenses, possible criminal charges, and the unforgettable humiliation of explaining to a judge that the deer wasn't the problem, the beer was. 14. Maine. You can't use a drone to hunt like it's a video game. Maine prohibits using drones or aircraft to assist in hunting wildlife, a rule that exists because technology keeps tempting people to turn nature into a remote-controlled video game. Picture a hunter standing on a hill with a controller, flying a drone across miles of forest while scanning for animals like he's playing the world's strangest surveillance simulator. The drone spots a moose. The hunter marks the location and heads straight for it, believing he has outsmarted the wilderness. The state disagrees. Wildlife laws emphasize fair chase, not aerial reconnaissance with Wi-Fi. Officers view drone-assisted hunting as the modern version of cheating. The consequences include fines, confiscated gear, and the painful realization that your expensive drone didn't help you hunt. It helped document the evidence against you. 15. Florida. Harassing manatees is the fastest way to meet federal charges. In Florida, disturbing or harassing manatees is illegal, and the penalties are serious because these slow-moving marine mammals are protected. Picture a group of tourists in shallow coastal water who see a manatee and immediately decide it's time for selfies, splashing, and amateur marine biology experiments. Someone tries to touch it. Someone else chases it for a better video. To them, it feels harmless. To wildlife officers, it's harassment of a protected species. Manatees rely on calm habitats to survive, and human interference stresses animals that are already vulnerable to boat strikes and habitat loss. The consequences are steep. Fines that can reach thousands of dollars and possible federal charges under wildlife protection laws. The lesson arrives quickly. When the animal weighs 1,000 pounds and still avoids you, maybe leave it alone. 16. Montana. You can't shoot from the road like it's a drive-by. Safari. In Montana, hunting from a public roadway is illegal. which sounds like common sense until someone treats a pickup truck like a rolling hunting blind. Picture a guy cruising along a gravel road through open ranch land, rifle resting on the window frame like he's auditioning for the worst wildlife documentary ever made. He spots a deer in a field, brakes hard, and lines up the shot without ever leaving the driver's seat. To him, it's efficient. To wildlife officers, it's reckless behavior that turns a public road into a firing lane. Roads exist for cars, hikers, and the occasional confused cow, not bullets. The consequences arrive quickly: fines, confiscated weapons, and possibly losing hunting privileges entirely. Montana has plenty of wilderness. If someone still hunts from the road, the problem isn't opportunity, it's effort. 17. Michigan. Spearing fish through the ice is legal, but only the right fish. Michigan allows ice fishing with spears in certain seasons, but the rules about which fish can be taken are extremely specific. Picture a fisherman standing over a hole cut into frozen lake ice, staring down into the dark water like a patient medieval hunter. Hours pass. Then, a shadow moves beneath the ice and adrenaline kicks in. The spear flies. Celebration begins. The only problem appears when a conservation officer checks the catch and asks a devastating question. Do you know what species that is? Suddenly, the moment of triumph turns into a biology exam nobody studied for. The difference between a legal catch and a protected species can mean serious fines and confiscated equipment. In Michigan, ice fishing rewards patience. Guessing wildly with a spear is how patience turns into paperwork. 18. Colorado. Using electronic devices to track wildlife isn't innovation. Colorado bans using certain electronic devices to aid hunting wildlife, especially when the technology removes the concept of fair chase. Imagine a hunter who decides the traditional approach is outdated and shows up with gadgets that look like they belong in a NASA lab. Rangefinders, trackers, digital mapping, everything except actual patience. In his mind, he's upgraded hunting into a high-tech operation. In the state's mind, he's bypassing the spirit of the sport entirely. Wildlife laws aim to keep hunting from turning into technological ambush. When officers discover someone relying on prohibited electronic assistance, the situation escalates quickly. The consequences include citations, confiscated equipment, and sometimes the suspension of hunting privileges. The lesson is simple. If the gear looks like it could launch a satellite, it probably doesn't belong in the woods. 19. Georgia. Shooting from a boat can turn a quiet lake into chaos. Georgia regulates hunting from boats in ways that surprise people who assume water automatically means fewer rules. Picture a hunter drifting quietly across a calm lake, shotgun ready, convinced the open water gives him freedom to shoot wherever wildlife appears. Then, a flock rises from the shoreline and instinct takes over. The shot rings out across the lake, echoing toward docks, cabins, and other boats that were not expecting an impromptu hunting demonstration. Wildlife officers view careless shooting from boats as a serious safety issue. Lakes are shared spaces filled with anglers, swimmers, and families enjoying the quiet. The consequences can include fines, confiscated firearms, and the kind of reputation that spreads quickly in small outdoor communities. The guy who turned a peaceful lake into target practice. 20. Pennsylvania. Sunday. Hunting was once basically forbidden. For decades in Pennsylvania, hunting on Sundays was heavily restricted, a rule rooted in old blue laws designed to preserve a day of rest. Picture a hunter waking up early on a crisp autumn morning, gear ready, coffee strong, only to remember the state once expected everyone, including deer, to observe a day off. While some of these restrictions have been loosened in recent years, the legacy of the law created generations of hunters staring at perfect weather and empty forests while legally forced to stay home. The rule existed for cultural and safety reasons, but it also produced one of the strangest traditions in American hunting, a weekly pause in the middle of prime season. The consequence wasn't a fine, it was the slow torture of watching Monday's forecast bring rain after a perfect Sunday. 21. Illinois. Hunting from an aircraft turns nature into a surveillance mission. Illinois law prohibits using aircraft to locate or take wildlife, which sounds like something out of a military manual rather than a hunting regulation. Picture a wealthy hobby hunter who decides traditional methods are inefficient and rents a small plane to scout deer populations from the sky. From above, animals are easy to spot moving across open fields, turning the hunt into a high-altitude reconnaissance mission. The pilot circles slowly, pointing out targets like a tour guide with very questionable priorities. Unfortunately for this airborne strategist, wildlife officers treat this tactic as cheating on an industrial scale. Hunting laws are built around the idea of fair chase, not aerial surveillance. The consequences aren't subtle: citations, confiscated equipment, and potentially losing hunting privileges entirely. Illinois doesn't reward innovation that turns wildlife management into a private air force. 22. Nevada. Shooting across a highway is how you create a disaster. Nevada prohibits discharging firearms across public roads while hunting, a rule that exists because bullets do not respect traffic lanes. Imagine a hunter spotting a mule deer on the far side of a desert highway. The shot looks easy. The distance seems manageable. What the hunter forgets is that highways are designed for moving vehicles, not long-range experiments in poor judgment. A bullet crossing asphalt doesn't just threaten the animal, it threatens drivers who never agreed to be part of someone else's hunting story. Wildlife officers take this rule seriously because accidents involving firearms and traffic rarely end well. The consequences escalate quickly: fines, weapon confiscation, and potentially criminal charges if the situation endangered others. Nevada offers millions of acres of open land. If someone still shoots across a road, the problem isn't opportunity, it's common sense. 23. Arkansas. Chasing wildlife with motorboats isn't a sport. Arkansas wildlife regulations prohibit using motorboats to chase or harass animals in waterways, which becomes understandable once you picture the chaos that would otherwise follow. Imagine a group of friends spotting a deer swimming across a wide river during migration season. Instead of watching quietly, they decide to fire up the boat engine and treat the entire scene like an outdoor version of a chase movie. The deer panics, the boat accelerates, and suddenly the river turns into a wildlife pursuit that nobody needed. To conservation officers, this isn't hunting, it's harassment that stresses animals already struggling through natural crossings. The consequences are immediate and unpleasant: fines, loss of hunting privileges, and the humiliation of explaining to authorities why someone thought chasing wildlife with a motorboat counted as outdoor recreation. 24. Utah. You can't use artificial light to turn night into a shooting gallery. Utah bans spotlighting wildlife for hunting purposes, a rule that exists because shining bright lights at night temporarily blinds animals. Picture a pickup truck creeping slowly along a dark rural road, a spotlight sweeping across fields like a low-budget UFO search. The beam lands on a deer, freezing the animal in confusion. To the person holding the light, it feels like an easy opportunity. To wildlife officials, it's a textbook example of unfair advantage that removes any concept of ethical hunting. Animals caught in a spotlight have little chance to react, turning the situation into something closer to target practice than hunting. The consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and sometimes losing hunting licenses entirely. In Utah, if your hunting strategy begins with a spotlight, the game warden is probably already halfway there. 25. South Carolina. Baiting deer can turn the forest into a trap. South Carolina has strict rules around baiting deer, particularly in areas where feeding wildlife can spread disease or create unfair hunting advantages. Imagine a hunter deciding patience is overrated and scattering piles of corn across the forest to lure animals into a predictable feeding spot. For a while it works. Deer appear regularly, and the hunter feels like a strategic genius. The problem is that concentrated feeding sites attract multiple animals and can accelerate the spread of diseases like chronic wasting disease. Wildlife agencies treat baiting as a serious ecological issue, not a clever shortcut. When officers discover illegal baiting operations, the results are unpleasant: fines, confiscated hunting equipment, and sometimes suspension of licenses. The forest is supposed to be unpredictable. Turning it into a buffet line is exactly what the law tries to prevent. 26. Oklahoma. Lassoing fish is not a real fishing technique. In Oklahoma, using a lasso to catch fish is illegal, Which raises an obvious question. Who looked at a lake and thought, this is a cowboy problem? Picture a man standing at the edge of a muddy pond with a rope, fully convinced that rodeo skills somehow translate to aquatic success. He spins the loop dramatically, throws it toward the water, and manages to create nothing except confusion among nearby anglers. The law exists because wildlife regulations define fishing methods clearly, and improvising with ranch equipment isn't one of them. To officers, this isn't creative, it's interference with legal fishing practices. The consequences aren't subtle: citations, confiscated gear, and the humiliation of explaining to a wildlife officer why a fishing trip turned into an accidental rodeo demonstration. 27. Kentucky. Fishing with a firearm is exactly as bad as it sounds. Kentucky law prohibits taking fish with firearms, which seems obvious until someone decides patience is optional. Imagine a fisherman standing on a riverbank, staring into shallow water where fish occasionally flash near the surface. After hours of waiting, frustration takes over and logic leaves the scene entirely. The fisherman raises a rifle and treats the river like a shooting range. The result is chaos, ricochets, frightened wildlife, and every nearby angler suddenly reconsidering their life choices. Wildlife officers treat this as both dangerous and destructive. Bullets don't stop neatly at the waterline, and the entire stunt turns a peaceful fishing spot into a public safety risk. The consequences include fines, confiscated weapons, and the unforgettable embarrassment of explaining that yes, the plan really was just shoot the fish. 28. Missouri. Using explosives in rivers turns you into the villain immediately. Missouri bans using explosives to kill or collect fish, a rule that exists because someone once believed maximum efficiency was a valid outdoor philosophy. Picture a fisherman who got tired of waiting for bites and decided the river needed a little encouragement. The explosion that follows doesn't just affect the fish, it disrupts the entire ecosystem, killing small species, damaging habitat, and sending shockwaves through the water. Nearby anglers suddenly find themselves part of a disaster movie nobody agreed to join. Conservation officers treat these incidents as serious environmental violations. The aftermath includes steep fines, criminal charges, and confiscated equipment. Missouri wildlife officials prefer people catch fish the slow way because the alternative usually involves sirens, paperwork, and a very awkward explanation in court. 29. Alabama. Shooting from a moving boat is a terrible idea. Alabama regulates hunting from boats, particularly when firearms are involved, because moving water and loaded weapons are a combination that rarely ends well. Imagine a hunter balancing in a small motorboat drifting through swampy backwaters, shotgun ready, trying to track birds overhead while the boat rocks unpredictably. One wrong movement, one unexpected wave, and the situation turns from sport to emergency in seconds. Wildlife officers enforce these rules because accidents involving firearms and unstable boats have a long history of ending badly. The consequences are serious: fines, confiscated firearms, and potentially losing hunting privileges entirely. Alabama has plenty of places to hunt safely. Turning a floating platform into a shaky shooting range is exactly the kind of decision the law was written to stop. 30. Vermont. You can't shoot wildlife from your car like it's a lazy safari. Vermont law makes it illegal to hunt wildlife from a motor vehicle, a rule that exists because someone eventually tried turning a quiet country road into a mobile hunting blind. Picture a hunter rolling slowly through a forest road, rifle resting across the steering wheel like this is somehow an acceptable field position. The logic seems simple: less walking, same results. Unfortunately for that hunter, Vermont wildlife officers have heard every variation of this story before. Hunting laws are built around effort and fairness, not convenience. Shooting from a vehicle removes both and creates safety risks for anyone nearby. The consequences come quickly: fines, confiscated weapons, and possibly losing hunting privileges entirely. Vermont forests reward patience. Trying to hunt from a driver's seat only rewards the game warden. 31. Washington. You can't harpoon fish from a horse, because someone apparently tried. In Washington state, certain fishing regulations specifically prohibit bizarre methods of taking fish that involve unconventional tools or transportation, which leads to one of the strangest mental images in outdoor law: someone attempting to harpoon fish while mounted on a horse. Picture a determined outdoorsman riding along a shallow riverbank like he's auditioning for the weirdest Western ever filmed. The horse is confused. The fish are confused. Everyone watching is deeply concerned. At some point, a harpoon enters the scene, and the situation stops being fishing and becomes performance art with a safety hazard. Regulations like this exist because wildlife agencies prefer clarity over chaos. The consequences for creative interpretations of fishing are predictable. Fines, confiscated gear, and the painful realization that if your fishing strategy looks like a medieval cavalry maneuver, the law probably already anticipated it. 32. Louisiana, catching fish with electricity, turns the bayou into a science experiment. Louisiana law prohibits using electrical current to capture fish without proper authorization, which sounds like a rule designed for people who watched one too many survival documentaries and learned the wrong lesson. Imagine someone standing beside a quiet bayou holding homemade equipment that looks suspiciously like it came from a garage engineering project. The plan is simple. Introduce electricity to the water and let stunned fish float conveniently to the surface. Unfortunately, ecosystems don't appreciate amateur electrical experiments. Electric current can injure non-target species, damage habitats, and create serious safety risks for anyone nearby. Wildlife officers treat unauthorized electrofishing as a major violation. The consequences include heavy fines, confiscated equipment, and possibly criminal charges. Louisiana wildlife officials would prefer people fish with patience, not with something that looks like a portable lightning storm. 33. North Dakota, chasing wildlife with snowmobiles. Isn't hunting. North Dakota prohibits pursuing or harassing wildlife with motorized vehicles like snowmobiles, a rule that becomes obvious the moment winter arrives and someone decides the frozen plains are a racetrack. Imagine a group of riders spotting a deer crossing a snowy field and deciding to turn the moment into an impromptu chase. Engines roar, snow flies, and the deer suddenly finds itself in a high-speed pursuit that nature never intended. Wildlife officials view this as harassment, not hunting. Animals forced to run in deep snow can quickly become exhausted or injured. When officers catch someone doing it, the consequences escalate quickly. Citations, confiscation of equipment, and suspension of hunting privileges. North Dakota winters are harsh enough already. Turning them into a motorized wildlife chase is exactly the kind of idea the law exists to prevent. 34. New Jersey. Using poison to catch fish is a fast way to destroy an entire stream. New Jersey law prohibits introducing poison or toxic substances into waterways to capture fish, a rule that exists because someone once believed this counted as fishing strategy. Picture a quiet stream running through a wooded area where an impatient fisherman decides waiting for a bite is too slow. Instead, he pours something toxic into the water and expects fish to float conveniently to the surface. What actually happens is far worse. Entire populations of aquatic life die, including species nobody intended to kill. Birds, amphibians, and other animals that rely on the stream can also suffer. Wildlife officers treat this as a severe environmental crime. The consequences include heavy fines and possible criminal charges. In New Jersey, if your fishing plan begins with poison, you're not fishing, you're committing ecological sabotage. 35. California. Taking protected species turns a simple trip into a federal problem. California has strict protections for certain wildlife species, meaning hunters must carefully identify animals before taking a shot. Imagine a hunter deep in the mountains spotting movement through thick brush. The shape looks promising, the distance seems right, and excitement overrides caution. The shot rings out. Moments later, reality appears when wildlife officers inspect the animal and ask a devastating question. Do you know what species that is? Misidentifying protected wildlife can trigger serious legal consequences because conservation laws exist to preserve vulnerable populations. The aftermath can include steep fines, confiscated weapons, and suspension of hunting licenses. The lesson arrives quickly and painfully. In California, pulling the trigger first and asking questions later is how a hunting trip turns into a legal education nobody wanted. 36. Oregon. You can't shoot wildlife from a moving car. Like it's an action movie. In Oregon, hunting from a moving vehicle is illegal, which sounds obvious until someone decides walking through the forest is too much work. Picture a hunter slowly driving down a narrow logging road with a rifle resting across the window frame like he's filming the lowest-budget wildlife documentary ever produced. He spots movement in the trees, brakes suddenly, and lines up a shot without even stepping outside the truck. To him, this feels efficient. To wildlife officers, it looks like reckless laziness with a firearm attached. Roads are shared spaces used by hikers, other hunters, and the occasional confused cyclist. Firing across them turns a peaceful forest into a safety hazard. The consequences are immediate: fines, confiscated weapons, and the deeply embarrassing realization that the deer escaped while the law did not. 37. Michigan. Using artificial light to hunt deer. Turns night into a trap. Michigan bans spotlighting deer at night because bright lights temporarily blind animals, removing any chance of fair escape. Imagine a pickup truck creeping through farmland after midnight while someone in the passenger seat sweeps a spotlight across fields like they're searching for UFOs. The beam lands on a deer, freezing it in confusion. To the people in the truck, it feels like a perfect opportunity. To conservation officers, it's cheating so blatant it practically comes with a confession. Spotlighting transforms hunting into an ambush where the animal has no chance to react. Wildlife officers treat the violation seriously because it undermines ethical hunting practices. The consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. In Michigan, if your hunting plan begins with a spotlight, you're not hunting, you're setting up evidence. 38. Texas. Hunting from a helicopter is not a sport. Texas has regulations preventing people from using aircraft to hunt wildlife without special permits, a rule that exists because someone eventually tried turning the sky into a shooting platform. Picture a wealthy thrill-seeker hovering in a helicopter above open ranch land, scanning the ground like he's playing the world's most expensive video game. From above, animals are easy to locate, making the hunt feel less like outdoor skill and more like aerial surveillance. Wildlife officials see this as the ultimate unfair advantage. Hunting laws emphasize effort, patience, and balance between predator and prey, not airborne targeting systems. When officers catch someone abusing aircraft for hunting, the penalties can include major fines, revoked licenses, and confiscated equipment. Texas may love big adventures, but turning a helicopter into a hunting drone crosses a line. 39. Alaska. Waste of game is a serious offense. In Alaska, wasting edible meat from harvested wildlife is illegal, and enforcement is strict because big game hunting carries major responsibility. Picture a hunter who finally bags a large moose after days of tracking through rugged wilderness. The excitement fades quickly when the reality sets in. That animal weighs hundreds of pounds and must be processed properly. Instead of doing the work, the hunter takes a few choice cuts and leaves the rest behind, assuming nobody will notice. Wildlife officers call this wanton waste, and they take it personally because Alaska's hunting culture revolves around respect for the animal. When officers discover abandoned meat, the consequences are severe: heavy fines, possible loss of hunting privileges, and public embarrassment within a community that values responsibility. In Alaska, harvesting game means using it, not wasting it. 40. Florida. You can't harass sea turtles for a photo opportunity. Florida law protects sea turtles, making it illegal to disturb or harass them on beaches or in the water. Picture a group of tourists walking along the shoreline at night when a massive sea turtle emerges to nest. Instead of quietly observing, phones come out, flashlights turn on, and someone decides the moment needs a closer selfie. The turtle becomes stressed, potentially abandoning the nest site entirely. Wildlife officials take these incidents seriously because sea turtle populations are fragile and nesting behavior is critical for survival. Officers regularly patrol beaches to prevent exactly this kind of interference. The consequences include steep fines and possible federal charges under wildlife protection laws. The lesson arrives quickly. When a prehistoric creature crawls out of the ocean to lay eggs, the correct response is respect, not a camera flash. 41. Minnesota. You can't use motor vehicles to run down wildlife. Minnesota law clearly prohibits chasing or killing wildlife using motor vehicles. which might sound like the kind of rule that shouldn't need to exist. Yet somewhere in the past, someone looked at a snowy field, saw a deer running across it, and decided horsepower was the solution. Picture a pickup truck accelerating across open farmland, bouncing over frozen ground while the driver tries to keep a terrified animal in front of the hood. It's reckless, cruel, and incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. Wildlife officers treat this behavior as serious harassment and illegal hunting. When caught, the consequences escalate quickly: heavy fines, confiscated vehicles in extreme cases, and suspension of hunting licenses. Minnesota has thousands of acres of wilderness. Turning a truck into a predator is exactly the kind of decision the law exists to stop. 42. Arizona. Hunting from a drone turns nature into a surveillance operation. Arizona prohibits using drones or remote aircraft to assist hunting, a rule that exists because modern technology makes cheating easier than ever. Imagine a hunter standing in the desert with a tablet, flying a drone miles away to locate animals hiding in the brush. From above, the drone identifies movement and sends back perfect coordinates, turning the hunt into a GPS-guided mission. To the hunter, it feels efficient and futuristic. To wildlife officials, it's the digital version of ambushing animals with surveillance technology. Hunting regulations emphasize fair chase, meaning the animal has a real chance to escape. Drone-assisted hunting eliminates that balance completely. The consequences are serious: fines, confiscated equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. In Arizona, if your hunting gear requires Wi-Fi and satellite maps, you're probably doing it wrong. 43. South Dakota. Shooting from a public road creates instant trouble. South Dakota bans shooting wildlife from public roads or across them, a rule designed to protect both animals and the people who share those roads. Imagine a hunter driving slowly through open prairie when he spots a pheasant in a nearby field. Instead of pulling over and approaching safely, he decides the road itself is good enough. The shotgun comes out, the shot echoes across the highway, and suddenly anyone driving nearby becomes an unwilling participant in the situation. Wildlife officers enforce this rule aggressively because rural roads are used by farmers, families, and other hunters. A single careless shot can travel far beyond its intended target. The consequences include fines, confiscated firearms, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. In South Dakota, roads are for travel, not target practice. 44. Louisiana. Harassing dolphins is a very bad idea. Louisiana waters are home to dolphins protected under federal law, and harassing them, whether by chasing, feeding, or attempting to interact, is illegal. Picture a group of boaters spotting dolphins swimming alongside their vessel in the Gulf. The moment starts magical, but someone inevitably decides it would be even better with a closer encounter. Engines rev, the boat turns sharply, and suddenly, the dolphins are being chased for entertainment. Wildlife officers consider this harassment of a protected marine mammal. Dolphins rely on natural behavior patterns, and aggressive human interaction can stress or injure them. When enforcement officers catch people doing it, the penalties can be severe: fines reaching thousands of dollars and potential federal charges. The dolphins simply wanted to swim past. The humans turned it into a legal case. 45. Colorado. Leaving bait to trap wildlife can backfire fast. Colorado regulations restrict baiting wildlife in many situations because feeding animals intentionally can disrupt natural behavior and create dangerous encounters. Picture a hunter scattering piles of food in the woods to lure animals into predictable locations. At first, it seems like a brilliant strategy. Deer show up regularly, and the hunter feels like a tactical genius. What he doesn't realize is that bait sites attract multiple animals, predators, and sometimes curious hikers. Wildlife officials view these setups as unfair hunting practices and potential public safety hazards. When officers discover illegal baiting operations, the consequences are unpleasant: fines, confiscated equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Colorado's forests operate on natural instincts. Turning them into a feeding station for easy shots is exactly the shortcut the law was written to stop. 46. Maine. Shooting near houses turns a quiet woods into a liability zone. In Maine, hunting laws prohibit discharging firearms within certain distances of occupied buildings unless you have permission. The rule exists because rural forests are not empty wilderness. They're full of cabins, camps, and people who would prefer not to be part of someone else's hunting story. Picture a hunter walking through thick woods when he spots movement near a tree line. The shot looks tempting, the distance seems manageable, and the hunter forgets one important detail. Somewhere beyond those trees is a cabin with people inside, drinking coffee and enjoying the morning. Wildlife officers treat unsafe shooting near homes as a serious offense because bullets don't stop when someone hopes they will. The consequences include fines, confiscated weapons, and possible suspension of hunting licenses. In Maine, respecting distance isn't optional, it's survival. 47. Arkansas. Fishing with chemicals turns a river into a disaster. Arkansas law prohibits introducing chemicals or toxic substances into waterways to capture fish. The reason becomes painfully clear the moment someone decides patience is overrated. Imagine a fisherman who spent an entire afternoon catching nothing and decides the river needs a little help. He pours chemicals into the water, expecting fish to float conveniently to the surface. What actually happens is environmental destruction. Fish die, but so do insects, plants, and other species that form the foundation of the ecosystem. Wildlife officers treat this kind of behavior as environmental vandalism. When authorities investigate these incidents, the consequences escalate quickly. Heavy fines, criminal charges, and confiscated equipment. The fisherman who wanted a quick dinner instead ends up with a court date. Rivers aren't laboratories, and impatience is not a fishing technique. 48. Idaho. Killing more fish than allowed isn't just greedy. Idaho enforces strict bag limits on fish species, meaning anglers are only allowed to keep a certain number per day. Picture an angler having the luckiest fishing day of his life. The fish keep biting, the cooler fills up quickly, and excitement replaces judgment. Instead of stopping at the legal limit, he decides one or two extra fish won't matter. Unfortunately for him, conservation officers regularly check catches along popular rivers and lakes. When they open the cooler and count more fish than allowed, the situation changes instantly. Bag limits exist to protect fish populations and ensure future seasons remain healthy. The consequences for ignoring them include fines, confiscation of illegally taken fish, and potential loss of fishing privileges. Idaho rewards skill and patience, not someone who mistakes abundance for permission. 49. Wyoming. Harassing wildlife in winter can be deadly for animals. Wyoming prohibits chasing or harassing wildlife, particularly during harsh winter months when animals are already struggling to survive. Imagine a group of people spotting elk moving slowly through deep snow. Instead of observing quietly, they decide to approach closer for photos or excitement. The animals begin running through snow that's already waist-deep, burning critical energy reserves needed to survive the winter. Wildlife officers treat these incidents seriously because exhausted animals may die days later after being forced to flee unnecessarily. When authorities catch people harassing wildlife, the consequences include fines and possible loss of hunting privileges. Wyoming winters are brutal enough without human interference. What looks like harmless excitement to people can become a death sentence for animals trying to survive the cold. 50. Alaska. Leaving trash while hunting can turn you into the problem. In Alaska, hunters are required to respect land use regulations, including proper disposal of waste and equipment. The rule exists because remote wilderness areas are easily damaged by careless behavior. Picture a hunter finishing a long trip in the backcountry and deciding packing out trash is too much trouble. Food wrappers, broken gear, and leftover supplies get abandoned at the campsite. At first, it seems harmless. After all, it's the middle of nowhere. But that trash attracts animals, alters their behavior, and leaves visible damage in places meant to remain wild. Wildlife officers take these violations seriously because public lands depend on responsible use. The consequences can include fines and restrictions on future access. Alaska's wilderness is famous for its beauty. Turning it into a landfill is the fastest way to lose the privilege of being there. 51. California. Catching lobsters with your bare hands is the only legal way. In California, Catching spiny lobsters during certain seasons is allowed only by hand or with simple tools like hoop nets. Spears and certain other methods are illegal. Picture a diver swimming along the rocky coastline at night with a flashlight, scanning crevices for lobsters hiding among the rocks. The moment he spots one, adrenaline kicks in and the chase begins underwater. The law requires that the lobster be captured by hand because using spears or other destructive tools can damage habitats and kill undersized lobsters accidentally. Imagine a diver ignoring the rule and trying to spear one anyway, only to have a wildlife officer waiting back on shore checking gear and catch limits. The consequences arrive quickly: fines, confiscated equipment, and the deeply embarrassing realization that the lobster hunt ended with paperwork instead of dinner. 52. New Hampshire. Using live fish as bait can spread disease. New Hampshire regulates the use of live fish as bait because moving species between lakes and rivers can spread disease or invasive organisms. Picture an angler who caught several small fish earlier in the day and decides they would make perfect bait in another lake miles away. It seems harmless. After all, they're just fish. But ecosystems are delicate systems where even small changes can create massive problems. Introducing infected bait fish can spread parasites or diseases to entire populations. Wildlife officers inspect bait containers for exactly this reason. When they discover someone transporting illegal bait, the situation turns serious quickly. The consequences include fines and confiscation of bait supplies. What seemed like a clever shortcut to attract bigger fish can instead trigger a legal problem and a lesson about how fragile aquatic ecosystems really are. 53. Montana. Shooting too close to livestock creates instant conflict. Montana hunting laws prohibit shooting wildlife in ways that endanger livestock or agricultural property. Picture a hunter spotting a deer near the edge of a ranch field. The excitement of the moment overrides caution, and he takes the shot without noticing cattle grazing just beyond the target area. The bullet misses the deer and sends nearby animals scattering across the field in panic. Ranchers in Montana depend on their livestock for their livelihood, and careless hunting near working land can cause serious problems. Wildlife officers investigate these situations quickly when complaints arise. The consequences include fines, potential liability for damages, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Montana's open landscapes may look empty, but they are shared spaces. Treating them like a personal shooting range is how a hunting trip turns into a legal dispute. 54. Florida. Collecting certain shellfish without a license is illegal. Florida regulates the harvesting of shellfish such as oysters and clams because these species are highly sensitive to overharvesting and water quality conditions. Picture a tourist walking along a shallow coastal flat during low tide and noticing clusters of oysters attached to rocks. The temptation seems obvious: free seafood lying right in the open. The tourist fills a bucket, imagining a great dinner later that night. What he doesn't realize is that many harvesting areas require specific licenses and are monitored for safety and conservation reasons. Wildlife officers routinely patrol these coastal zones to prevent illegal harvesting. When they encounter someone collecting shellfish without the proper permits, the consequences include fines and confiscated catch. In Florida, seafood may be everywhere, but that doesn't mean it's free. 55. Pennsylvania. Hunting too close to schools is strictly forbidden. Pennsylvania law prohibits hunting within certain distances of schools and other public areas to ensure safety. Imagine a hunter exploring wooded land on the edge of a small rural town. The trees seem dense, wildlife signs are everywhere, and it feels like the perfect hunting location. What the hunter fails to realize is that just beyond the tree line sits a school playground where children spend their afternoons. Wildlife officers enforce buffer zones strictly because firearms and populated areas are a dangerous combination. When someone ignores these boundaries, authorities respond quickly. The consequences include fines, possible suspension of hunting licenses, and serious legal trouble if anyone was endangered. In Pennsylvania, the rule is simple. If the woods are close enough to hear children playing, it's too close to fire a gun. 56. Kansas. Hunting without permission turns you into a trespasser with a rifle. Kansas hunting laws require permission before entering private land, a rule that exists because not every open field is an invitation. Picture a hunter driving through rural farmland who spots a group of deer grazing peacefully behind a fence line. Instead of tracking down the landowner, he decides the opportunity is too good to ignore. He climbs the fence, moves quietly across the field, and lines up his shot like the land belongs to him. Unfortunately, Kansas landowners are known for noticing strangers wandering around with firearms. Wildlife officers treat illegal trespassing while hunting very seriously because it combines property violations with public safety concerns. The consequences escalate quickly: fines, confiscated equipment, and potentially losing hunting privileges. Kansas has millions of acres of land, but if you skip permission, you're not hunting, you're trespassing. 57. Alaska. Killing more game than you can carry becomes a crime. Fast in Alaska, hunters are required to salvage edible meat from harvested animals, which means you can't just shoot game and walk away when the work becomes inconvenient. Picture a hunter deep in remote wilderness who finally takes down a massive moose. The celebration lasts about 10 minutes before reality arrives. That animal weighs hundreds of pounds and must be processed carefully in rough terrain. Instead of doing the hard work, the hunter removes a few trophy parts and abandons the rest. Wildlife officers call this wanton waste, and in Alaska, it's treated as a serious violation of hunting ethics. When authorities discover abandoned carcasses, the penalties can be severe: heavy fines, confiscation of gear, and possible loss of hunting privileges. In Alaska, harvesting wildlife comes with responsibility. Shooting it is the easy part. 58. Michigan. Netting fish outside legal methods is an instant violation. Michigan carefully regulates fishing methods, including when and where nets can be used. Picture a fisherman standing on a dock, watching other anglers patiently casting lines while he secretly prepares something more ambitious: a large net hidden behind a cooler. His plan is simple: scoop up several fish at once instead of waiting for a bite. Unfortunately, recreational netting outside specific regulations disrupts fish populations and can accidentally trap protected species. Conservation officers patrol popular waters specifically to catch this kind of shortcut. When they see someone hauling in a net full of fish, the inspection begins immediately. The consequences include fines, confiscated gear, and losing fishing privileges. In Michigan, fishing rewards patience. Turning it into a bulk harvesting operation is exactly what the law tries to prevent. 59. Oregon. Harassing marine wildlife is not entertainment. Oregon protects marine wildlife along its coastline, including seals and sea lions that often gather near harbors and docks. Picture a group of tourists spotting a large sea lion resting on a floating dock. Instead of keeping their distance, they start clapping, shouting, and tossing objects to make the animal react for videos. At first, it seems like harmless fun, but wildlife officers know that disturbing resting animals causes stress and can lead to aggressive encounters. Sea lions are powerful animals, capable of injuring people who get too close. Regulations exist to keep both humans and wildlife safe. When authorities witness harassment, the penalties include fines and potential legal charges. The sea lion simply wanted a quiet place to rest. Turning that moment into a viral video is how a vacation becomes a citation. 60. Texas. Fishing without a license is the fastest way to get caught. Texas requires fishing licenses for most anglers, and enforcement officers routinely patrol lakes and rivers checking permits. Picture someone visiting a popular fishing spot who decides the license requirement probably isn't a big deal. He casts his line confidently, enjoying a peaceful afternoon by the water, completely unaware that conservation officers often approach quietly from behind. The conversation usually starts politely. Mind if I see your license? When the angler admits he doesn't have one, the situation changes quickly. Fishing licenses fund conservation programs that protect fish populations and maintain public waterways. Skipping that requirement isn't seen as harmless. It's avoiding the system that keeps the sport alive. The consequences include fines and sometimes additional penalties depending on the situation. In Texas, the fish might ignore your bait, but wardens rarely ignore missing paperwork. 61. Arizona. You can't hunt from a moving vehicle like it's a drive-through safari. Arizona hunting regulations prohibit taking wildlife from a moving motor vehicle, which sounds obvious until someone decides walking through the desert is optional. Picture a hunter slowly cruising along a dusty road in a pickup truck, scanning the landscape through binoculars like he's on a wildlife tour he accidentally brought a rifle to. Suddenly, he spots a mule deer grazing in the distance. Instead of parking and approaching responsibly, he rolls down the window and treats the truck like a mobile hunting blind. To him, it feels efficient. To wildlife officers, it looks like reckless behavior that turns public land into a shooting lane. Vehicles move unpredictably, and firing from them increases risk for other hunters and hikers. The consequences arrive quickly. Fines, confiscated weapons, and the realization that the easiest shot of the day was the one he wasn't allowed to take. 62. Colorado. Shooting too close to a road is asking for trouble. Colorado law prohibits hunting too close to public roads because bullets don't stop just because someone hopes they will. Picture a hunter hiking through rolling hills when he spots an elk on the opposite side of a dirt road. The distance looks manageable, the shot seems clean, and excitement replaces caution. Without thinking about traffic or what lies beyond the target, he raises his rifle and fires across the road. Wildlife officers treat this situation as extremely dangerous because roads are shared spaces. Vehicles, hikers, and other hunters may appear unexpectedly. Even a perfectly aimed shot can ricochet or travel farther than intended. The consequences include steep fines, confiscated weapons, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Colorado's mountains offer endless hunting opportunities, but if the bullet crosses a road, the hunt becomes a liability. 63. Florida. Feeding wildlife creates animals that stop fearing humans. Florida regulations prohibit feeding many wild animals because it changes their behavior and creates dangerous encounters. Picture a family visiting a lakeside park where they spot a raccoon wandering near the picnic tables. Someone decides to toss it a piece of bread for fun. The raccoon happily accepts, and suddenly the moment feels charming. The problem appears later when that same raccoon starts approaching every visitor expecting food. Animals that lose fear of humans become aggressive, raid campsites, and sometimes bite people. Wildlife officers deal with these situations regularly, and animals that become too comfortable around humans often have to be relocated or euthanized. The consequences for feeding wildlife include fines and citations. The intention may have been kindness, but the result often creates a much bigger problem than anyone expected. 64. Nevada. Using artificial light to hunt turns night into an ambush. Nevada prohibits spotlighting wildlife at night because bright lights temporarily blind animals and eliminate any chance of escape. Picture a truck rolling slowly through desert terrain after midnight, a powerful spotlight sweeping across the landscape. The beam lands on a group of deer and freezes them in place, confused and unable to see clearly. For the person holding the light, it looks like the perfect opportunity. For wildlife officers, it's a classic example of illegal hunting. Ethical hunting relies on fair chase, meaning the animal has a real chance to detect danger and escape. Spotlighting removes that balance completely. When officers catch someone using lights this way, the penalties can include fines, confiscated firearms, and loss of hunting privileges. In Nevada, if your hunting plan starts with a spotlight, the game warden is probably already nearby. 65. Wyoming. Shooting from a highway creates a massive safety risk. Wyoming law prohibits discharging firearms from or across public highways while hunting. The rule exists because highways are filled with drivers who didn't agree to participate in someone else's hunting trip. Picture a hunter driving through wide-open prairie when he spots an antelope grazing on the far side of the road. Instead of pulling over and approaching responsibly, he decides the road itself is a convenient shooting position. The rifle comes out, the shot rings across the highway, and suddenly anyone driving nearby is at risk. Wildlife officers treat these violations seriously because a bullet traveling across a roadway can cause catastrophic accidents. The consequences include heavy fines, confiscated weapons, and possible criminal charges. Wyoming offers millions of acres of hunting land. Using the highway as a shooting lane is how a hunt turns into a crime. 66. Georgia. Hunting while intoxicated is a disaster waiting to happen. Georgia prohibits hunting while under the influence of alcohol or drugs, a rule that exists because firearms and impaired judgment are a dangerous combination. Picture a hunter treating opening day like a celebration instead of a responsibility. The morning begins with a cooler of drinks, a few jokes among friends, and the belief that one or two won't matter. As the day continues, coordination fades and decisions become worse. A rifle that requires steady aim is suddenly controlled by someone whose balance and focus are compromised. Wildlife officers enforce these laws strictly because intoxicated hunters create serious risks for everyone in the area. When someone is caught hunting while impaired, the consequences include fines, license suspension, and potential criminal charges. In Georgia, the forest isn't a bar, and firearms aren't party accessories.
67. Minnesota. Harassing animals with vehicles isn't hunting.
Minnesota wildlife regulations prohibit chasing animals with motor vehicles such as ATVs or trucks. Picture a group of riders exploring snowy back roads when they spot a deer trying to cross an open field. Instead of letting the animal move peacefully, they turn the moment into a chase. Engines roar, tires spin, and the deer suddenly finds itself fleeing across deep snow while machines close in behind it. Wildlife officers consider this harassment, not hunting. Animals forced to run through heavy snow quickly burn critical energy reserves needed to survive harsh winter conditions. When authorities catch people doing this, the consequences escalate quickly. Fines, confiscation of equipment, and loss of hunting privileges. Minnesota winters are already brutal for wildlife. Turning a recreational vehicle into a predator is exactly the kind of behavior the law exists to stop.
68. Louisiana. Taking more than the bag limit turns success into a violation.
Louisiana enforces strict bag limits on fish and game to protect wildlife populations from overharvesting. Picture an angler having the kind of fishing day people brag about for years. The fish keep biting, the cooler fills quickly, and excitement replaces caution. Instead of stopping when the legal limit is reached, the angler decides a few extra fish won't make a difference. Unfortunately, wildlife officers routinely check catches along popular waterways. When they open the cooler and start counting, the mood changes instantly. Bag limits exist to ensure healthy fish populations for future seasons. Ignoring them turns a successful trip into a violation of conservation law. The consequences include fines, confiscated catch, and possible suspension of fishing privileges. In Louisiana, the moment you pass the limit, luck stops being a story and becomes evidence.
69.
California. Using illegal traps can injure animals and people. California regulates the use of traps for wildlife because poorly designed or illegal traps can injure non-target animals or even people. Imagine someone setting up homemade traps in a wooded area after watching a few questionable survival videos online. The trap looks impressive: metal springs, wires, and a questionable amount of confidence in amateur engineering. Unfortunately, wildlife doesn't follow instructions, and the first creature to trigger the trap might not be the intended target. Pets, protected species, or even hikers can be injured by illegal trapping devices. Wildlife officers treat unauthorized traps seriously because they create uncontrolled hazards in public land. When discovered, the consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and possible criminal charges. In California, if your trapping device looks like something built during a weekend science experiment, it probably violates the law.
70. Alaska.
Shooting from roads turns hunting into a public safety risk. Alaska prohibits shooting wildlife from or across public roads, a rule designed to protect both animals and people traveling through remote areas. Picture a hunter driving along a gravel road through vast wilderness when he spots a moose grazing near the tree line. Instead of leaving the vehicle and approaching responsibly, he decides the road offers a perfect vantage point. The rifle comes out, the shot echoes across the road, and suddenly anyone driving nearby becomes part of the situation. Wildlife officers enforce this rule aggressively because remote roads often have limited visibility and unpredictable traffic. A single careless shot can travel far beyond its intended target. The consequences include fines, confiscated weapons, and possible loss of hunting privileges. In Alaska, the wilderness is vast, but roads are not shooting ranges. 71.
Oregon. Harassing elk during winter can be lethal for the animal. Oregon prohibits harassing wildlife, especially during winter months when animals already struggle to survive harsh conditions. Picture a group of hikers spotting a herd of elk moving slowly through deep snow. Instead of quietly observing, someone decides to get closer for better photos. The group approaches, laughing and shouting, until the elk suddenly bolt across the snowy hillside. What looks like harmless excitement to humans becomes a serious problem for the animals. Running through deep snow burns precious energy reserves elk rely on to survive winter. Wildlife officers treat these incidents seriously because animals forced to flee repeatedly can weaken and die days later. When authorities catch people intentionally disturbing wildlife, the consequences include fines and citations. Oregon's forests are beautiful, but chasing animals for entertainment can quickly become a deadly mistake. 72. Texas. Hunting without landowner permission is trespassing. Texas hunting regulations require hunters to obtain permission before entering private property. The rule exists because Texas contains vast areas of privately owned ranch land where wildlife and livestock share the same space. Picture a hunter driving through rural countryside who spots several deer grazing peacefully beyond a fence. The opportunity looks too good to pass up, so he climbs the fence and quietly moves into the field. Unfortunately for him, ranch owners often keep close watch over their property and don't appreciate strangers wandering around with rifles. Wildlife officers treat this as both trespassing and illegal hunting. When caught, the consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and potential loss of hunting privileges. Texas offers enormous hunting opportunities, but if the land isn't yours and you don't have permission, the hunt ends with a citation. 73. Michigan. Ice fishing with too many lines can get you in trouble. Michigan regulates how many fishing lines an angler can use at once during ice fishing season. Imagine a fisherman standing on a frozen lake surrounded by holes drilled into the ice. Instead of using a couple of lines like everyone else, he decides more lines equal more fish. Soon the ice looks like a strange fishing experiment, with rods and lines scattered across the frozen surface like a small underwater surveillance system. Conservation officers patrol frozen lakes precisely to catch this kind of overconfidence. The moment they count more lines than the legal limit allows, the situation changes quickly. The consequences include fines and confiscated gear. Ice fishing may look peaceful from the outside, but Michigan regulations ensure that even on frozen lakes, fairness still matters. 74. Florida. Taking too many lobsters can trigger serious penalties. Florida carefully regulates lobster harvesting through seasonal limits and daily bag restrictions. Picture a diver exploring a rocky reef during lobster season and having the luckiest dive of his life. Every crevice seems to hide another lobster. Excitement builds as he fills his bag, convinced he's discovered the ocean's ultimate seafood jackpot. What he forgets is that Florida wildlife officers routinely inspect catches when divers return to shore. When the officer starts counting and the total exceeds the legal limit, the mood changes instantly. Bag limits exist to prevent over-harvesting and protect lobster populations. Violating them isn't treated lightly. The consequences include steep fines, confiscated catch, and possible suspension of fishing licenses. In Florida, the ocean may look endless, but the law still counts every lobster. 75. Colorado. Using illegal bait can spread disease among wildlife. Colorado restricts certain baiting practices because concentrated feeding areas can spread diseases among wildlife populations. Picture a hunter scattering large piles of corn in a forest clearing, convinced he has discovered the perfect way to attract deer. At first, the plan works. Animals begin visiting the spot regularly, creating what looks like a reliable hunting location. The problem appears later when multiple animals gather at the same feeding site, increasing the chance of disease transmission. Wildlife officials monitor baiting closely because illnesses such as chronic wasting disease can devastate deer populations. When officers discover illegal baiting sites, the consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Colorado's wildlife laws aim to protect ecosystems, not reward shortcuts that turn forests into feeding stations. 76. Alaska. Killing a bear and not reporting it can turn into a major investigation. In Alaska, hunters who take certain large animals such as bears must report the harvest within specific time limits. The rule exists because wildlife officials track populations carefully across the vast wilderness. Picture a hunter deep in remote backcountry who successfully harvests a black bear after days of tracking. The experience feels like a triumph, and he decides reporting the kill is unnecessary paperwork. Days pass, and the story spreads among friends. Eventually, someone mentions the unreported bear to authorities. Alaska wildlife officers take these reports seriously because unreported harvests can disrupt population monitoring and conservation planning. When investigators confirm a violation, the consequences can include heavy fines and loss of hunting privileges. In Alaska, harvesting wildlife carries responsibilities beyond the hunt itself. Ignoring those responsibilities can quickly turn success into a legal problem. 77. Wyoming. Shooting too close to buildings can end the hunt immediately. Wyoming prohibits discharging firearms within certain distances of occupied buildings unless permission is granted. Picture a hunter walking across open rangeland who spots a pronghorn antelope grazing near a distant barn. The distance looks manageable, and the shot seems possible. What the hunter fails to consider is that the barn belongs to a working ranch where people may be nearby. Wildlife officers enforce distance rules strictly because bullets travel much farther than many hunters realize. Even a carefully aimed shot can create serious risk for people on private property. When authorities investigate unsafe shooting near buildings, the consequences include fines and potential suspension of hunting licenses. Wyoming's wide landscapes may appear empty, but homes and ranches often sit just beyond the horizon. Ignoring that fact can end a hunting trip quickly. 78. Maine. Using illegal bait to attract bears is a serious violation. Maine allows bear hunting under strict conditions, including specific regulations about baiting practices. Picture a hunter deep in northern forest setting up bait barrels to attract black bears. The system works when done legally, but problems begin when someone decides to ignore the rules, using unauthorized bait types or placing bait sites in prohibited areas. At first, it seems like a clever shortcut to increase chances of success, but wildlife officers regularly monitor bait sites and investigate suspicious setups. When they discover illegal baiting, the situation escalates quickly because improper bait can attract bears too close to human settlements. The consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and suspension of hunting privileges. Maine's bear management system depends on careful regulation. Turning baiting into an uncontrolled experiment is how a hunting strategy becomes a legal problem. 79. Montana. Shooting from a moving ATV turns the trail into a hazard. Montana regulations prohibit using motorized vehicles like ATVs to pursue or shoot wildlife. Picture a rider exploring rugged trails when he spots a deer running across an open hillside. Instead of stopping and approaching responsibly, he decides the ATV gives him the perfect advantage. The engine roars, the chase begins, and the hunt turns into a high-speed pursuit across uneven terrain. Wildlife officers view this as harassment and illegal hunting because vehicles remove any concept of fair chase. They also create safety risks for other riders and hikers using the same trails. When authorities catch someone using an ATV to chase wildlife, the consequences can include fines, confiscation of equipment, and suspension of hunting privileges. Montana's wilderness rewards skill and patience, not horsepower. 80. Florida. Collecting too many shellfish can close an entire harvest area. Florida regulates shellfish harvesting carefully because coastal ecosystems are highly sensitive to overcollection. Picture a group of visitors exploring tidal flats during low tide and discovering clusters of oysters and clams scattered across the shoreline. Excited by the apparent abundance, they begin filling buckets quickly. What they don't realize is that shellfish populations depend on strict harvesting limits to remain sustainable. Wildlife officers patrol coastal areas to enforce these rules. When authorities discover someone collecting beyond the allowed limit, the situation changes immediately. The consequences include fines and confiscated catch. Overharvesting can also lead to temporary closures of entire harvesting zones, affecting local communities that depend on these resources. In Florida's coastal waters, a bucket of extra shellfish can create a much larger problem. 81. Arizona. Using electronic calls for certain animals can be illegal. Arizona regulates the use of electronic calling devices when hunting certain wildlife species. Picture a hunter sitting quietly in desert brush with a small speaker playing recorded animal sounds. The device imitates distressed prey so convincingly that predators in the area believe dinner is calling them directly. At first, it feels like a clever strategy, technology doing the hard work. But wildlife regulations restrict these devices for some species because they can dramatically alter natural behavior and create unfair advantages. Conservation officers know exactly what to look for when they see suspicious equipment in the field. When someone uses illegal electronic calls, the consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. In Arizona, hunting is supposed to test skill and patience, not who brought the loudest speaker. 82. Minnesota. Leaving fishing lines unattended can create serious problems. Minnesota fishing regulations prohibit leaving certain fishing setups unattended for extended periods. Picture an angler drilling holes through lake ice and setting several lines before wandering away to warm up inside a nearby cabin. Hours pass while the lines remain in the water, with nobody watching them. The problem is that unattended gear can trap fish unnecessarily or create hazards for other anglers moving across the ice. Conservation officers patrol frozen lakes specifically to prevent this kind of situation. When they find unattended lines exceeding legal limits or left too long without supervision, the consequences include fines and confiscated equipment. Ice fishing may look peaceful, but the regulations remind anglers that responsibility doesn't disappear just because the lake is frozen. 83. Louisiana. Hunting from public roads can create dangerous situations. Louisiana prohibits shooting wildlife from public roads because roads are shared spaces used by drivers, cyclists, and other hunters. Picture a hunter driving slowly through rural countryside when he spots a deer feeding near the edge of a field. Instead of leaving the road and approaching carefully, he raises his rifle from the driver's seat and prepares to fire. The shot may appear simple, but bullets travel unpredictably, and roads are not designed to be firing lanes. Wildlife officers enforce this rule aggressively because careless shooting near traffic can lead to serious accidents. When someone violates the regulation, the consequences include fines, confiscated weapons, and possible suspension of hunting licenses. Louisiana's open landscapes offer many safe hunting opportunities. Turning a public road into a shooting position is not one of them. 84. Colorado. Using live wildlife as bait is strictly forbidden. Colorado prohibits using live animals as bait for hunting predators, a rule designed to prevent unnecessary cruelty and protect wildlife populations. Picture a hunter setting up a trap site and tying a small animal nearby in hopes of attracting larger predators. At first glance, it may seem like an effective strategy. In reality, the practice causes extreme stress and suffering for the bait animal and disrupts natural predator behavior. Wildlife officers treat these violations seriously because ethical hunting standards are built around minimizing unnecessary harm. When authorities discover someone using live bait illegally, the consequences include fines, confiscated equipment, and suspension of hunting privileges. Colorado wildlife regulations exist to maintain fairness and humane treatment of animals. Turning one animal into bait for another crosses a line the law does not tolerate. 85. California. Ignoring fishing seasons can damage entire fish populations. California strictly enforces fishing seasons for many species to protect spawning cycles and ensure long-term population health. Picture an angler discovering a quiet river full of fish during a time of year when the water seems perfect for fishing. The temptation to cast a line is strong, especially when nobody else is around. What the angler fails to consider is that the season is closed because fish are spawning. Catching them during this vulnerable period can disrupt reproduction and reduce future populations dramatically. Wildlife officers conduct regular patrols and inspections to enforce seasonal closures. When someone is caught fishing during a closed season, the consequences include fines and confiscated equipment. California's fishing seasons exist to protect the future of the sport. Ignoring them risks damaging the entire ecosystem. 86. Texas. Hunting from a helicopter without permission is a legal disaster. Texas has regulations controlling when aircraft can be used in wildlife management, and using a helicopter to hunt without proper authorization is illegal. Picture a wealthy thrill seeker hovering above open ranch land in a rented helicopter, scanning the ground for animals like he's playing a very expensive video game. From the air, spotting wildlife becomes easy. Animals moving through fields suddenly look like targets on a map. The hunter believes he has discovered the ultimate advantage. Wildlife officers see something very different, an airborne hunting operation that completely destroys the concept of fair chase. When authorities investigate unauthorized helicopter hunting, the penalties can be severe. Fines, revoked licenses, and confiscated equipment are all possible outcomes. Texas offers huge landscapes for traditional hunting. Turning the sky into a shooting platform crosses a line. 87. Michigan. Spearing the wrong fish can ruin an ice fishing trip. Michigan allows spearing certain fish species during ice fishing season, but strict identification rules apply. Picture a fisherman standing above a hole cut into thick lake ice, staring down into the dark water below. Hours pass before a large shadow finally moves beneath the ice. The spear launches instantly, and celebration begins. Unfortunately, the excitement fades quickly when a conservation officer examines the catch and identifies it as a protected species. Michigan's fish regulations are detailed because different species have different population limits and protections. Spearing the wrong fish is treated as taking protected wildlife. The consequences include fines, confiscation of the catch, and potential suspension of fishing privileges. Ice fishing rewards patience and knowledge. Throwing a spear without knowing exactly what you're targeting is how victory turns into evidence. 88. Florida. Disturbing nesting sea turtles can bring federal charges. Florida protects nesting sea turtles under both state and federal wildlife laws. Picture a late-night walk along a quiet beach when someone spots a massive sea turtle crawling slowly onto the sand to lay eggs. The moment feels rare and exciting. Phones appear, flashlights turn on, and people move closer to capture the perfect video. Unfortunately, bright lights and human presence can cause the turtle to abandon the nesting process entirely. Wildlife officers patrol many beaches specifically to prevent this kind of disturbance. When authorities catch people interfering with nesting turtles, the consequences can include significant fines and possible federal charges. Sea turtles have survived for millions of years. Sometimes the biggest threat they face is a group of tourists who wanted a better photo. 89. Montana. Leaving game meat to spoil is treated as waste. Montana hunting laws require hunters to salvage edible portions of harvested animals. Picture a hunter successfully taking down a large elk after days of tracking through rugged mountain terrain. The moment feels like victory until the hunter realizes how much work is involved in properly processing and transporting the meat. Instead of doing the hard labor, he removes a few trophy parts and abandons the rest of the animal. Wildlife officers refer to this as wanton waste and treat it as a serious violation of hunting ethics. When authorities discover abandoned carcasses, the penalties can include heavy fines and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Montana's hunting culture emphasizes respect for the animal. Taking the trophy while leaving the meat behind is exactly the behavior the law was written to prevent. 90. Arizona. Harassing wildlife with vehicles is illegal. Arizona prohibits chasing or harassing wildlife using vehicles such as trucks or ATVs. Picture a group of off-road riders exploring desert trails when they notice a herd of animals moving across open terrain. Instead of slowing down, someone decides it would be exciting to follow them. Engines rev, dust clouds rise, and the animals suddenly find themselves fleeing across rough ground while machines close in behind them. Wildlife officers classify this behavior as harassment because it stresses animals and can cause injury or death. Off-road vehicles are powerful tools that easily overpower wildlife trying to escape. When authorities catch riders chasing animals this way, the consequences include fines, confiscation of equipment, and possible suspension of hunting privileges. Arizona's deserts are meant for exploration, not high-speed wildlife pursuits. 91. New York. Fishing without a license is a very short conversation with a warden. In New York, most anglers must carry a valid fishing license while fishing, and conservation officers regularly patrol rivers and lakes checking permits. Picture someone enjoying a quiet afternoon casting a line into a calm mountain stream. The water looks perfect, the weather is ideal,
and the angler assumes nobody will bother checking paperwork in such a peaceful place. Then a conservation officer appears from the trail with a simple question: "Can I see your license?" The moment becomes uncomfortable very quickly. Fishing licenses fund conservation programs that protect waterways and fish populations across the state. Skipping the requirement is treated as avoiding the system that keeps the sport alive. The consequences include fines and possible additional penalties. In New York, the fish might ignore your bait, but wardens rarely ignore missing licenses. 92. Alaska. Hunting out of season can trigger serious penalties. Alaska enforces strict hunting seasons to protect wildlife populations during breeding and migration periods. Picture a hunter exploring remote wilderness who spots a massive bull moose during a time of year when the season is closed. The temptation is enormous. An animal like that represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Instead of walking away, the hunter convinces himself the risk is worth it. Unfortunately for him, wildlife officers monitor hunting activity closely, and reports of illegal harvests spread quickly in rural communities. When authorities investigate out-of-season kills, the penalties can be severe. Fines, confiscated equipment, and loss of hunting privileges are common outcomes. Alaska's hunting seasons exist to keep wildlife populations healthy. Ignoring them might bring a moment of success, but it almost always ends with a legal disaster. 93. California. Taking undersized fish violates conservation rules. California fishing regulations include strict size limits for many species to ensure younger fish have time to mature and reproduce. Picture an angler standing on a coastal pier who finally catches a fish after hours of waiting. The excitement is immediate, and the fish goes straight into the cooler without a second thought. Unfortunately, conservation officers often carry measuring tools for exactly this situation. When they inspect the catch and measure the fish, the result may reveal the fish is smaller than the legal size limit. Keeping undersized fish removes young animals from the population before they have a chance to reproduce. Wildlife officers enforce these rules to maintain sustainable fisheries. The consequences include fines and confiscation of the catch. In California, every fish may feel like a victory, but the tape measure makes the final decision. 94. Florida. Fishing in restricted areas can lead to immediate citations. Florida designates certain waters as restricted or protected zones where fishing is not allowed. Picture a fisherman discovering a quiet mangrove channel far from crowded public docks. The water is calm, fish are clearly visible, and it feels like a hidden paradise. What the fisherman doesn't notice is the sign posted nearby marking the area as a protected habitat. These zones exist to protect spawning fish and fragile ecosystems that cannot handle heavy fishing pressure. Wildlife officers patrol coastal regions specifically to enforce these restrictions. When someone is caught fishing in a protected zone, the consequences include fines and confiscation of equipment. The peaceful fishing spot that looked like a secret location suddenly becomes the scene of a very official conversation. 95. Wyoming. Shooting across property boundaries can escalate quickly. Wyoming hunting laws emphasize safety and respect for property boundaries. Picture a hunter spotting a deer near a fence line separating two ranches. The animal stands just beyond the boundary, but the hunter believes the shot is still possible from his side. Without thinking about where the bullet will travel, he takes the shot across the fence. Unfortunately, property lines matter not just legally, but also for safety. Bullets crossing into neighboring land can endanger livestock, property, or people. Wildlife officers treat these incidents seriously when reported by landowners. The consequences include fines, possible civil liability, and suspension of hunting privileges. Wyoming's vast landscapes may look empty, but property boundaries and safety rules remain very real. Ignoring them is how a hunting trip becomes a legal dispute. 96. Tennessee. Fishing with explosives is not a shortcut. Tennessee fishing regulations prohibit using explosives to catch fish, a rule that sounds obvious until someone decides patience is overrated. Picture a fisherman standing on the bank of a quiet river after hours without a single bite. Frustration builds, and suddenly the idea of using something more efficient crosses his mind. A small explosive tossed into the water would certainly bring fish to the surface, along with every conservation officer within hearing distance. Explosives don't just kill fish, they destroy habitats and wipe out entire populations in seconds. Wildlife officers treat these violations extremely seriously. When someone attempts explosive fishing, the consequences can include heavy fines, criminal charges, and confiscated equipment. In Tennessee, fishing is supposed to involve bait, patience, and luck. If your plan involves an explosion, you've already lost.
97. Idaho. Hunting from a boat under power brakes. Fair chase rules.
Idaho hunting regulations prohibit shooting wildlife from a motorboat while the engine is running. Picture a hunter gliding quietly along a mountain lake when a deer appears on the shoreline. The boat is perfectly positioned, the rifle is within reach, and the opportunity feels too convenient to ignore. But hunting from a powered boat removes the balance between hunter and animal. Wildlife officers refer to this principle as fair chase, meaning the animal must have a reasonable chance to detect danger and escape. Using a motorboat as a moving shooting platform eliminates that balance completely. When authorities catch someone doing this, the consequences include fines and potential suspension of hunting privileges. Idaho's wilderness rewards skill and patience. Turning a boat into a floating sniper perch is exactly what the law forbids.
98. Washington. Harassing orcas can bring massive penalties.
Washington state enforces strict protections for orcas and other marine mammals. Picture a group of boaters spotting a pod of orcas moving through coastal waters. The moment feels extraordinary, and excitement pushes them closer for a better view. Engines roar as the boat approaches, cameras ready for the perfect wildlife shot. What they don't realize is that disturbing marine mammals disrupts feeding and migration behavior. Orcas are protected species, and wildlife authorities monitor boat activity around them carefully. When officials determine a vessel intentionally approached too closely, the consequences can be severe: large fines and potential federal penalties. The ocean might seem endless, but marine wildlife laws are extremely clear. In Washington waters, chasing orcas for a photo is the fastest way to become part of a legal report.
99.
Arkansas. Shooting wildlife from a highway creates immediate danger. Arkansas law prohibits firing weapons from or across public highways. Picture a hunter driving along a rural road when he spots a deer standing just beyond a field fence. The temptation is immediate. Instead of stopping safely and approaching the area properly, he raises the rifle from the roadside and fires across the highway. In that moment, the road becomes part of the trajectory. Bullets don't stop for traffic, and wildlife officers treat this behavior as a serious safety violation. Highways carry unpredictable vehicles and people who never expected to be anywhere near a hunting situation. When authorities investigate these incidents, the consequences can include heavy fines, confiscated weapons, and possible criminal charges. Arkansas offers millions of acres for hunting. Turning a highway into a shooting lane is not one of them.
100.
Alaska. Chasing animals with aircraft ends the hunt immediately. Alaska law prohibits using aircraft to locate or chase wildlife for hunting purposes without strict regulation. Picture a pilot flying low over remote wilderness scanning valleys for moose or caribou. From the air, animals become easy to spot moving across open terrain. The pilot radios a friend on the ground with coordinates, essentially turning the wilderness into a tracking map. Wildlife authorities consider this unfair and dangerous because aircraft eliminate any chance for animals to avoid hunters. When investigators uncover aircraft-assisted hunting, the penalties can be severe: fines, confiscated equipment, and suspension of hunting privileges. Alaska's wilderness is massive, but the rules protecting wildlife are just as serious. When the hunt starts with a plane instead of a pair of boots, the ending is usually written by a judge. So the next time someone tells you hunting and fishing laws are simple, remember this list. Because somewhere in American history, someone tried every single one of these ideas. Someone chased animals with trucks, someone tried fishing with explosives, someone decided highways were perfectly good shooting ranges, and every time that happened, a wildlife officer had to sit down and write a brand new rule. Which means these laws aren't random, they're evidence. Evidence that when humans go into the wilderness, logic occasionally stays in the car.